Welcome to Say the Question. I'm Joe, that's Sam, and today we're getting into Chimpanzee Reality Check. Why something that looks familiar can make us feel safer than we should, and what that says about how we judge danger.
Yeah, because that is exactly where the weirdness starts. In one survey, people shown a chimpanzee next to a human were 30.3% more likely to call it an appealing pet than people who saw the chimp alone. Same animal, different frame, suddenly everybody gets casual.
Right, and that's the starting take. Familiarity can blunt good judgment. Sam, start us off.
Okay, here's the uncomfortable part. I think people soften chimpanzees in their heads because they look enough like us to feel familiar. And the second something feels familiar, people start lowering the danger label, even when the animal absolutely did not sign up to be cute and relatable for our benefit.
That's the right place to start. The basic idea is not that people are stupid or that chimps are cartoon villains. It's that resemblance changes how risk gets processed. If something has a face that reads as expressive, people tend to file it under social before they file it under animal that can hurt me.
Yes, and I think that filing system is the whole problem. Humans are weirdly willing to trust anything that looks like it might have feelings, even if the only feeling involved is, I would like that hand to stay attached to my body.
That's the blunt version, sure. But I'd separate two things. One is emotional familiarity, and the other is actual safety. Those are not the same at all, and people keep acting like they are. A familiar-looking animal can still be unpredictable, and unpredictability is the part your nervous system is supposed to care about.
So the mistake isn't just chimps are dangerous, because that part is obvious enough. The mistake is that they don't get sorted with the same mental alarm level as, say, a big animal that doesn't resemble us at all. If it doesn't look like a weird little person in a fur coat, people seem to keep the danger box sealed shut.
I think that's close, with one caveat. It's not always that people deny the danger. Sometimes they just downplay it. Because familiarity makes the danger feel impolite to say out loud. There's a social pressure to sound calm, reasonable, and appreciative of the animal's specialness, which can slide into pretending your instincts are being rude.
That's the part I keep coming back to. People don't just see a chimp. They see a near human, and then they start negotiating with themselves. I mean, look at that face. Surely it's not that bad. That's not analysis. That's your brain trying to be polite to something that doesn't care if you're polite.
Right, and the politeness can get absurd. It's like the resemblance earns the animal a softer category than it deserves. Not because the animal is fake or symbolic or anything dramatic, but because people confuse looking emotionally legible with being safe. Those are very different things, and humans are embarrassingly willing to blur them.
Joe, am I overstating it if I say the resemblance almost works against clear thinking? Like, if a thing looks just human enough, people start narrating it instead of assessing it.
No, that's fair. I'd just sharpen it. The resemblance doesn't make people irrational in some total sense. It makes them biased in a very specific direction. They may still know, abstractly, that the animal can be dangerous, but emotionally, the familiarity keeps whispering, maybe not that dangerous. Maybe we're being harsh.
And that whisper matters, because danger judgment is never just a spreadsheet. It's also disgust, caution, social pressure, and whatever story you tell yourself about what kind of creature is in front of you. Chimpanzees hit a weird pressure point because they look close enough to us to trigger sympathy and close enough to us to make the risk feel almost rude to name.
That's the clean version. The weird part is not only that chimps can be dangerous, It's that their resemblance changes how we emotionally file that danger. And once that filing gets too soft, people stop asking the sharper question, which is whether familiarity is making them less honest about the risk.
And that is where the topic gets slippery, because nobody wants to admit they're letting looks do half the reasoning. It feels better to say you're being balanced or respectful, but sometimes what you're really doing is giving the familiar thing a softer hearing than it earned.
I think that's part of it. But there's also a simpler habit. When an animal looks emotionally readable, people start projecting intention and personality onto it. That can be harmless with pets, but with a wild animal, it becomes a bad shortcut. Readable is not the same thing as safe, and it definitely isn't the same thing as predictable.
So the fair version isn't everyone is being stupid. It's more like our brains are using the wrong social tool for the job. We see a near person and start acting as if familiarity buys trust, which is a terrible bargain when the thing in front of you has its own agenda.
Exactly, and that's why this doesn't stay a chimp story. It's a human story about how quickly looks familiar turns into must be understandable, and then, somehow, must be safe. Those steps are not the same, but they blur fast when people want to feel sophisticated instead of cautious.
Yeah, and that blur is probably why people get touchy about saying the obvious part out loud. They don't want to sound crude or dramatic, so they trim the warning until it sounds civilized. Then the warning is so polished, it stops warning anybody.
That's the pressure point. The real question isn't whether chimps are monstrous or adorable. It's why familiarity keeps convincing us to soften the file before we've even looked at the evidence. And once you see that, you can ask why people do the same thing with other animals that feel close enough to us to be emotionally expensive to name.
Okay, but before we get too polished about it, let's just sit with why this feels wrong in the first place. A chimp doesn't land in your head like a normal animal. It's not just dangerous animal, it's dangerous animal that makes you think it might understand the room. That mixed signal is what makes people uneasy before they even decide what they think about chimps.
That's the starting point. Familiarity pulls one way, caution pulls the other, and people end up holding both reactions at once. So the discomfort isn't random. It's what happens when something feels close enough to read, but not close enough to trust.
And once something looks even a little bit like us, every little cue gets loaded. A stare feels personal. A grin feels readable. A hand reaching out can feel friendly for half a second before the sane part of your brain catches up and says, no, that's still a wild animal.
Right, and media or zoo footage makes that worse because it keeps showing the human-ish moments. People don't just carry around the idea of a strong animal. They carry around the idea of a strong animal that keeps inviting comparison to a person, which is exactly why it can feel fascinating and unsettling at the same time.
That's the ugly little mix. It's not simple fear, and it's not simple affection either. It's more like, I want to understand this thing, and I don't fully trust the part of me that wants to understand it too quickly.
That mix is why people can sound inconsistent without being stupid. Somebody can say, I love how interesting chimps are, and also mean, I do not want to pretend this is just a cute interaction. Those are not automatically contradictory thoughts. They're just two reactions trying to survive in the same head.
So what part of that is actually fair, Joe? Is it the resemblance itself? Or are people mostly projecting human feelings onto something that doesn't care about our categories? Because those are pretty different complaints, even if they get mashed together a lot.
The fair part is that resemblance changes the emotional math.
Okay, that's the clean version. You're not saying the chimp is more dangerous because it looks like us in some moral sense. You're saying the look changes how people process the risk, and that can make them hesitate, overread, or soften it before they've even thought it through.
Exactly. And once that hesitation is there, people build a story around it so they can live with their reaction. Some people downplay the danger because they don't want to sound cruel or paranoid. Others sharpen the danger because they think anybody who sounds sentimental is missing the obvious. Either way, the resemblance is shaping the argument before the argument starts.
And that is where it gets socially awkward. If you sound too casual, you look naive. If you sound too careful, you look like you're dodging the hard part. So people end up talking in this mushy middle where they can admit the fascination but never quite say the caution out loud.
Which is usually the sign that the topic is doing something real to people. They aren't just forming an opinion, they're managing a feeling. And with chimps, the feeling is especially tangled because the animal is close enough to invite empathy and far enough to demand caution. That tension is the whole story so far.
So the next question is, what people actually mean when they say chimp danger? Are they talking about behavior, closeness, control, or just the fact that it feels wrong to be calm about a face that familiar? Because if we don't separate those things, we end up arguing past each other the whole time.
Yeah, and that's the useful split. There's the emotional reaction, which is real, and then there's the question of what it proves, which is a lot less tidy. If we keep those separate, we can talk about the actual risk without pretending the discomfort is imaginary.
Right, because the point isn't to shame the weird feeling away. It's to figure out whether the feeling is telling us something useful or just making us overconfident in a story. And that's where the conversation finally gets honest, instead of just vibes with a pulse. Okay, before we get lost in the vibe of it, we should pin down what chimpanzee risk even means here. Are we talking about danger to a person standing near a chimp? Or are we talking about the way people get weirdly loose with the word because chimps look familiar?
I'd define it pretty boringly. Risk is the chance that a human-chimp interaction goes badly, plus how bad it gets when it does. So if somebody says chimps are risky, they should mean practical danger, not I had a strong feeling while watching a documentary.
So the word risk is doing real work there. It's not a moral judgment, and it's not a personality test for the animal.
No, and that's where people blur three different claims. One is physical resemblance, one is behavioral similarity, and one is emotional familiarity.
That's the useful version, because people mash all three together like they're the same knob. Then everybody argues past each other and pretends they're being precise.
They aren't. Physical resemblance is about what it looks like. Behavioral similarity is about what it does. Emotional familiarity is about how our brains respond to it. Those can overlap, but they don't prove each other. A thing can feel familiar without being especially safe, and it can be behaviorally legible without being anything like us in the way people casually mean it.
Okay, but behavioral similarity is the one that sounds like it might matter. If it acts in a way we can read, isn't that the part people are trying to point at?
Sort of. But that's where the fair version and the sloppy version split. The fair version is, some behaviors are easier for humans to interpret because they map onto things we recognize. The sloppy version is, Therefore, the animal is basically a person in a different outfit. Or, therefore, my gut feeling about it is a safety report.
So the fair claim is about readability, not identity. The sloppy claim is when people turn readability into a whole personality chart.
Exactly. And readability cuts both ways, which people skip. If something is easy to read, you may think you understand it faster than you actually do. That can make people overtrust it, or it can make them overfear it. But either way, they start filling in blanks with their own assumptions.
That sounds like the actual problem. Not that the resemblance means nothing, but that people treat the resemblance like a shortcut past the hard part.
Right. If you want the clean version, resemblance can explain why the reaction is strong. It does not, by itself, tell you whether the reaction is accurate. That's the key difference everybody keeps stepping over.
So when somebody says they look like us, the useful follow-up is, okay, in what sense? Because that sentence is carrying a lot of freelance labor.
Mostly, yes. If they mean the face, the gestures, the social cues, that explains familiarity. If they mean behavior, that needs more care. And if they mean, therefore I should lower my guard, that's a completely different claim, and it needs actual support.
Which is where people get slippery, because they don't always notice they're changing claims mid-sentence. They start with, this feels familiar, and end with, so this isn't really dangerous, which is a pretty wild jump.
Yeah, and I don't even think most of them are trying to be tricky. It's more like the brain hears familiarity and starts relaxing before the reasoning catches up. The feeling is real, but it needs to be translated before it gets to make decisions for you.
So the emotional familiarity is the part people can honestly report, but it doesn't get to overrule the danger question. It can explain why they care, not settle what they should conclude.
That's the clean version of it. Familiarity can make something feel more legible, and legibility can make people more confident than they should be. But if we're being fair, the question is still about risk, not just recognition.
Right. And that reaction is the part I'm interested in, because I don't think people are just being shallow for no reason.
No, they usually aren't. The familiar feeling is doing something real, even when the conclusion it pushes them toward is sloppy. That's the useful line to hold on to before we start judging anybody's instinct.
Okay, but before we get into why people downplay it, I want the gut version on the table. Mine is kind of embarrassing, which feels appropriate here. If somebody tells me chimpanzees are basically harmless and people are just projecting onto them, my immediate thought is, that sounds like the exact sentence a person says right before they underestimate something.
That's pretty close to mine, just in a quieter register. The strange part is not that the animal resembles us. It's that the resemblance can make people relax instead of tense up, like familiarity is somehow a safety certificate.
Right, and it's not even pure fear. It's that weird half step where your brain notices a face that feels readable, a posture that feels almost conversational, and then you have to stop yourself from pretending that means more than it does.
That's the piece people skip. They act like the only options are panic or affection, but the real first reaction is usually more awkward than that. Cautious recognition, plus a little self-consciousness about having a reaction in the first place.
And then the self-consciousness gets silly fast. One part of you wants to be the adult in the room, and the other part is saying, no, I have enough instinct to know this is not a golden retriever with opinions.
I think the first reaction is often just the sense that this is too close to the human category for comfort. And that makes people feel like they should react more elegantly than they actually do.
Embarrassment.
Exactly. You feel a little stupid for being unsettled by something that looks expressive and almost readable. And then you wonder if that makes you unfair. But uneasy is not the same thing as irrational, and that's where the honest version starts.
Yeah, and I think some people overcorrect because they don't want to sound crude or old-fashioned. So they hear discomfort and immediately try to scrub it away. Like admitting unease automatically means you're being primitive or mean.
Do you think that's the real motive, though? Is it actually kindness, or is it people wanting to sound sophisticated about something that makes them nervous and doesn't fit neatly into their preferred little moral script?
Probably both. Some of it is genuine concern about sounding unfair, and some of it is social self-defense. Nobody wants to be the person in the room who says, "That thing freaks me out," and then spends 10 minutes getting judged for the tone instead of the claim.
That's very normal, unfortunately. If you say the blunt version too fast, everybody starts arguing about your manners before they ever touch the actual point. And then the point gets flattened into something safer and dumber.
And that's where the fake choice comes from. Suddenly, you're either a monster who hates animals, or you're so enlightened that you have to pretend danger isn't real just to prove you're a good person.
Which is a terrible trade. The more honest version is smaller. People may underplay the risk because the animal looks familiar, and familiar-looking things get filed mentally as safer than they are.
Or at least safer than they feel in your gut. That's the trap, right? "I can read its face" is not the same thing as "I know what it will do." But people blur those together because the first one makes them feel less awkward.
That's the clean distinction. Readable is not harmless, and familiar-looking is not the same as domesticated. Those are exactly the little jumps people make before they notice they've made them. And that's probably where the first bad answer shows up.
Okay, before we get fancy, the bad first answers are pretty easy to spot. One is, chimps are basically just people with hair, so if you're nervous around them, you're being embarrassing. The other is, no, they're just dangerous animals, and anyone talking about resemblance is being sentimental.
That's the fork, yeah. Both are lazy because one flattens the similarity and the other flattens the difference. And once you do that, you stop actually answering the question.
The basically human version is weirdly comforting, too. It lets people feel morally advanced, like they've outgrown the old scared animal reflex and joined the enlightened club.
And the opposite version feels efficient. If you can file everything under dangerous animal, you don't have to think about why the resemblance bothers people in the first place. You just get to sound sturdy and move on.
So which lie is more tempting, do you think? The cuddly one or the tough guy one?
Probably the cuddly one, because it comes with a little moral self-congratulation baked in. People like thinking they're the sort of person who sees the soul in everything. The problem is that seeing the soul in something does not tell you how it behaves.
Right, and then the conversation gets stupid fast. One person starts talking like a chimp is a misunderstood coworker, and another person goes full nature documentary warning label and acts like fear itself is wisdom.
Neither one is an argument. The first one confuses familiarity with harmlessness. The second confuses caution with insight. That's the part people keep skipping.
That's the bit I wanted to pin down. Because don't be weirdly afraid is not the same thing as stop noticing there may be a real risk. Those are not the same sentence, even if people talk like they are.
Exactly. The bad first answer is pretending the whole issue is just prejudice, when what people are reacting to is a mix of resemblance, power, and unpredictability. You can think an animal is fascinating and still think your body would be dumb to treat it like a house pet.
And we do this with other animals all the time. People sentimentalize dogs, cats, Even animals that are clearly not built to be little emotional support roommates, and then act shocked when reality refuses to match the vibe.
That's a good comparison. The point isn't that affection makes you stupid, it's that familiarity can make you project a story onto something and then mistake the story for the thing itself. With chimps, the projection runs in both directions. Some people turn them into furry people, and some people turn them into pure menace.
So the sentimental version always acts like closeness automatically means safety. It doesn't. Closeness can make something more interesting, more relatable, or more disturbing without making it less dangerous.
And that's the distinction that matters. Familiarity changes how we feel about the animal, not whether the animal has limits. If you blur those together, you end up either over-trusting it or disrespecting the people who are trying to describe the risk honestly.
So the first answer fails because it turns a real pattern of projection into a moral sermon. And the second answer fails because it pretends projection is the whole story. Neither one actually separates familiarity, danger, and whatever weird emotional charge people are reacting to.
Yeah, that clean split is what we need next. What part of the reaction is just human projection? What part is a fair warning? And what part is people using one to cover for the other? Okay, so the real fork is whether looking human makes people sloppy or whether it makes the danger easier to read. Those are not the same claim, and I think people keep mashing them together because both feel emotionally true. One version is, we got too soft because it seemed familiar. The other is, it seemed familiar, so the risk became more legible. Those lead to very different answers.
My first instinct is still sloppy. If something has a face, hands, eye contact, people start sliding into basically one of us territory, and then the guardrails get weird. Nobody wants to sound cold, so they call caution overreacting and move on. That's how you end up being polite to the thing that deserves a little respect and a lot of distance. It's not that people think chimpanzees are cute little roommates. It's that they start negotiating with their own discomfort instead of taking it seriously.
I get that, but I think you're skipping the other half. Familiar looking doesn't always soften the warning. Sometimes it makes the warning louder because you can picture exactly.
Or you picture how much damage it can do when it decides not to be cooperative.
That's the cleaner version, yeah. If something feels close to us, the mind doesn't only reach for empathy. It also reaches for intention, social rules, and the idea that this thing is capable of choosing. That can make people less casual, not more. In other words, resemblance can make an animal feel more understandable without making it feel harmless. Those are separate mental moves, and people don't always make them in the same order.
Sure, but that's still the part I think gets flattened. People don't always react with some noble, careful respect. A lot of the time they react with a bad version of familiarity. They see the resemblance and start acting like distance is optional, like they can improvise because the creature feels socially readable. That's the dangerous move. It's not that they think chimpanzees are harmless. It's that they trust their own comfort too much and mistake it for judgment.
That's fair. But if we're being precise, the problem isn't familiarity by itself. It's what people do with it. Some people get closer and get lazy. Others get closer and get sharper, because now the risk feels specific instead of abstract. So when you say, people downplay the danger, are you talking about the first reflex they have, or the way they explain it after the fact? Those are different failures.
Mostly the reflex. The after-the-fact explanation is just where they clean it up. They don't walk around announcing, I'm choosing to be careless. They walk around with the wrong frame in their head. It becomes, this feels familiar enough to treat casually. when the smarter frame is familiar is not the same as safe. That's why I think the resemblance can quietly mess with people before they ever get to the point of arguing about it.
Okay, but there is a reason the other interpretation is still alive. Resemblance can also make people more alert because it ruins the fantasy that this is just some abstract animal out there in the trees. It feels closer to a social being, which can make the boundary clearer, not fuzzier. You stop thinking in cartoon terms. You stop thinking, well, it looks cute, so it must be manageable. That reaction isn't denial. It's a better read on the situation.
That's the part I won't dismiss. If something seems closer to us, some people absolutely get more careful, not less. They notice the intention in it, or at least the possibility of intention, and that changes the tone fast. So I don't think the resemblance story is one simple psychological trap. I think it can go either way. I'm just saying one of those directions is easier to underestimate because it disguises itself as being normal, familiar, and emotionally reasonable.
That's the better version of your point, honestly. Not people are irrational because faces are spooky, but faces can smuggle in the wrong level of comfort. And my version is not familiarity is good, it's familiarity can also be a warning system when it makes the risk feel real. So, we're left with a genuinely annoying answer. Resemblance can dull judgment or sharpen it, and the only way to tell which one is happening is to look at what people actually do, not just what they say they feel.
Okay, let's get out of the pure vibe zone and look at the receipts. Because if the whole argument is chimpanzees feel familiar, so people soften the danger, that ought to show up somewhere outside our little ape brain seminar.
And it does, at least in the basic sense. One survey found that people shown a chimpanzee standing next to a human were 30.3% more likely to say the chimpanzee seemed appealing as a pet than people shown the chimp alone.
That's such a dumb little detail, and I mean that lovingly. Put the chimp next to a person, and suddenly our brains go, oh, it's basically in the family portrait.
That's the useful part, though. It doesn't prove people think chimps are harmless, but it does show that the human context changes the emotional read. The chimp is no longer just an animal. It starts to look social, familiar, almost manageable.
So the picture does half the selling before anybody even starts thinking. That's annoying because it means the danger isn't only the animal, it's the frame around the animal.
Exactly. And that same basic effect shows up in the commercial side too. There's research suggesting that when chimpanzees are used as entertainment in ads, it can distort public perception of their conservation status. In plain English, the cute or funny framing can make people less aware of what kind of animal they're actually looking at.
So if the chimp is dancing in a commercial, the audience doesn't just see a chimp. They see a tiny little social cue that says, relax, this is normal, this is fine. This is basically a mascot.
Pretty much. And that's why careful messaging matters. The basic idea is that repeated human-friendly framing can shift what people think chimps are and how appropriate it feels to keep them close to people.
So is the issue that people are gullible, or that the image does a lot of the work for them before they even notice it?
Mostly the second one. I don't think the fair version is everyone is stupid. It's that human likeness is a very efficient shortcut. And shortcuts are useful, right up until they make a risky thing feel domesticated.
Which is the annoying part, because the cue is cheap. You don't need a full argument. You just put the animal in a human setting and people start borrowing the wrong expectations.
Right, and I wouldn't overread the 30.3% number as if it means every person suddenly wants a chimp in the living room. The point is narrower. Context nudges perception in a predictable direction, and that's enough to matter when the underlying risk is already real.
So, what's the honest version of that concern? Because people are manipulated by pictures sounds a little too slick if we leave it there.
The honest version is that the image doesn't create the danger, it changes the feeling around the danger. That's a smaller claim, but it's a stronger one. If you make something look familiar, people downgrade their caution before they even ask whether they should.
And that's the part people miss. Familiarity doesn't just make an animal likable, it can make the warning label feel optional.
That's the pressure point. And there's a harder piece here, too. A nature analysis argued that lethal aggression in chimpanzees is best explained by adaptive strategies for resources or mates, not by human impact. So the idea that chimp aggression is just some weird side effect of captivity or humans being around them is too neat.
Meaning they're only dangerous because we messed them up story is too comfy.
Yeah, it's cleaner than reality. Chimps are not made dangerous only by bad human handling. Some of the aggression we're talking about is part of their biology in the wild, too. That matters because it keeps us from pretending the risk is just a modern media invention.
So the real-world version is even less cute than the poster version. And if you need a plain language authority line, the WWF basically says, chimpanzees are a threat to human or public health because of life-threatening zoonotic diseases and physical attributes that can harm humans. That is not exactly great with kids and houseplants.
No, that's not a good pet pitch. And it's not just abstract caution either. Chimpanzees are also an endangered species, and the illegal pet trade is part of why the whole close to humans equals safe or cute idea is so misleading.
So the receipts do two things at once. They back up the suspicion that human framing can downplay risk, and they also kill the softer excuse that chimps are basically harmless unless a person ruins them. Both of those are too simple.
That's the clean version. The flimsy argument is people are just overreacting to an animal that looks like us. The stronger argument is familiar-looking animals get mentally softened, and that softening can make real danger and real conservation stakes harder to see.
Okay, the mistake people keep making is trying to shove chimpanzees into one clean box. Either they are basically humans in a fur coat, or they are just another animal and the whole conversation is over. Both versions are too neat, and that neatness is the problem.
That is the useful place to start. The real answer keeps two things true at once. The resemblance makes people project, and the difference still matters when you are talking about actual risk. If you erase either side, you end up with a cartoon.
Joe, am I overstating this if I say the public basically hates that answer because it is annoying? It asks people to hold two thoughts, and everyone wants a cleaner label than that.
No, that is pretty fair. A clean label feels like an answer you can carry around. The trouble is that the label starts doing the thinking for you, and then you stop noticing what it leaves out.
So why does the conversation keep sliding into the dumb versions? Is it just people wanting a simple category? Or is there something about the animal itself that invites the bad framing?
Both, honestly. Simple categories are sticky. But familiarity does a lot of the work here. If something looks a bit human, people start reading it like a social partner, and that can soften judgment before they have thought it through. There was even that image study where a human presence made people more open to seeing a chimpanzee as an appealing pet. That is a good example of how resemblance can bend the first reaction.
So the face says neighbor, and the brain starts filing away the warning labels, not because the animal changed, but because our first instinct is to make it feel less scary than it is.
Exactly. Comfort is a lousy risk manager. The problem is not that people are stupid. It is that once something looks familiar, the mind gets lazy about where the line is.
And then the opposite lazy version shows up. They are wild, end of story, nothing to learn here. That lets people avoid the weird part, which is that they are close enough to us to trigger our social instincts. And then
we start treating resemblance like a safety guarantee. That is the bad move.
Right. And that is why the middle ground annoys people. It does not let you land on a slogan. It says you can be fascinated without being naive and cautious without pretending the animal is some movie villain.
That is the clean version. The messier version is that labels do social work. Basically human sounds compassionate, but it can flatten the risk. Just an animal sounds tough, but it can flatten the resemblance and the reasons people keep misreading it.
So the sticky public version is not just wrong because it is too simple. It is sticky because it lets people stop holding two ideas in their head at the same time. And honestly, that is half of public life right there.
That is probably the real reason. Careful distinctions are harder to repeat, harder to turn into a headline, and harder to use as a moral pose. A slogan gives you instant certainty. The middle ground gives you work.
And the useful sentence, if we have to pin one down, is something like this. They are familiar enough to project onto, different enough to hurt you. That is not elegant, but it is a lot more honest than either extreme.
That is the sentence people do not really want. Because it refuses both the pet fantasy and the monster fantasy. But it is the right shape of answer. It keeps the fascination and the caution in the same room without pretending they like each other.
So the next awkward question is not just what chimps are. It is what kind of person needs them to be gentler than they are.
Yeah, once you notice that softening the danger can be about ego, comfort, or sentiment, the conversation gets less cute and more revealing.
Okay, so once we've cleaned up the bad explanations, the next question is the awkward one. What do people say out loud, and what do they actually mean when a chimp makes them uneasy? Because the public version always sounds so clean. It's all admiration and stewardship, and we need to respect them, which, sure, fine. But that can't be the whole emotional picture.
That's the right split. The polite answer is usually something like, they're remarkable, they're intelligent, they're close to us in a few ways, and that's not false. The less polished answer is that resemblance does not make the danger feel smaller. It can make it feel more confusing, because your brain stops filing it under simple animal risk and starts treating it like something you might read wrong.
So the public version is admiration, and the private version is, this thing has hands and a face and a brain that makes me nervous. That's the part people don't want to say because it sounds rude, even though it's just a description of the gut reaction.
That is closer to the honest version, but I'd phrase it a little less crudely. It's not always a conscious fear statement. Sometimes it's just that familiar features change the brain's risk estimate. Something that looks readable feels more negotiable, and that can be a mistake. The problem is not that the instinct exists. The problem is that people let the instinct do more work than it should.
Joe, am I overstating that? Because more negotiable sounds like the part people won't admit. It's the part that sounds embarrassing in public, which usually means it's the part worth looking at first.
I think it's the useful part, with one caveat. People do soften it for social reasons. Nobody wants to sound like they're reacting to an animal with the same language they'd use for a threat from a stranger. So they reach for gentler words, and sometimes those words are honest enough. But sometimes they're a shield. They let you keep the discomfort without naming what the discomfort is actually about.
Right, because saying, I find that visually unsettling sounds weirdly honest, and saying, we should protect their dignity sounds much nicer. One of those tells the truth about your nerves, and the other one lets you look civilized while your brain is still doing the math in the background.
Exactly, and I'm not mocking that impulse. We do this with charismatic animals a lot, and with anything that sits too close to the human category. The more an animal resembles us, the more people get pulled into a messy split. Admiration on one side, caution on the other. And then language that tries to keep both without sounding alarmed. The language isn't always lying. It's often trying to avoid sounding ugly.
That sounds fair, but doesn't the nice language still do something sneaky? It can make the risk sound abstract, like it's just a philosophical vibe instead of a real animal with real force. People hear fascinating, and their brain starts drifting away from this could still hurt you badly if you get casual.
That's the basic idea. The polite answer focuses on status, intelligence, and our discomfort with domination. The real answer is simpler and less flattering. Visual familiarity changes emotional calibration. It makes the animal feel less like an ordinary animal and more like something you can read, negotiate with, or misjudge. That doesn't prove anyone is being fake. It just means the face matters to the judgment more than people like admitting.
And once the face starts carrying that much weight, people start doing the little verbal cleanup around it. They describe the animal in the safest possible way, and then act like the safest possible language is the same thing as the clearest one.
Mostly, yes. And that distinction matters, because if you think the problem is hypocrisy, you argue about honesty. If the problem is instinct plus social manners, then the better move is to admit the instinct, name the risk cleanly, and stop pretending a friendly face changes the physics. It changes the feeling first. That's the part people keep trying to dress up.
So it's not people are fake. It's people are smoothing over a messy instinct they don't know how to phrase without sounding like a jerk. That's a better answer than pretending everybody is secretly a philosopher and a saint at the same time.
Yeah, and I think that's the honest landing spot. You can say the polite thing without making it a lie, but you shouldn't let the polite thing erase the actual instinct underneath it. If anything, the honest version is more useful because it tells you where judgment gets distorted before someone talks themselves into a bad call.
Okay, so the next question is where that honesty turns into overreaction, because admitting the instinct is one thing, turning it into a free pass to get stupid is another. Okay, so we've squeezed most of the romance out of this thing, and now I'm interested in the ugly part. When does curiosity about chimpanzees stop being curiosity and turn into bad advice, gossip, or just plain intrusion?
That's the line. Curiosity asks what the risk is and why people misread it. Bad advice asks how close you can get because you feel like you understand it. Those aren't the same impulse, even though people talk as if they are.
And people absolutely blur them. They hear don't underestimate them and somehow turn it into a dramatic little identity project, like being the person who gets it is the whole point.
Or the opposite. They hear they're intelligent and start acting like intelligence is a force field. It isn't. Empathy helps you read behavior, but it doesn't cancel teeth, strength, or panic. The basic idea is simple. You can be fascinated without pretending the animal is harmless,
or pretending your fascination makes you qualified to improvise around it.
Exactly. If your conclusion is, I feel a deep connection, therefore the danger is overblown, that's sentimental, not careful. It feels humane, but it can push you into the wrong level of confidence very fast.
So where's the line then? Because some people treat any hard-edged question as cruelty, and other people use just asking questions as cover for being reckless. I don't want to confuse those two things, but people sure do.
The clean boundary is whether the question helps you understand risk or helps you talk yourself into ignoring it. If the answer changes your behavior in a safer way, that's useful curiosity. If it changes your behavior in a more theatrical way, you've probably wandered off. The point is not to be timid. It's to be honest about what the question is doing to your judgment.
That's the part that keeps bugging me. Once people get a picture in their head, they start performing for it. Look how calm I am. Look how close I can stand. Look how much I respect this creature. It becomes less about understanding the animal and more about managing the audience in their own head.
And then caution gets embarrassed out of the room. Nobody wants to be the boring person saying, "Please, just don't be stupid." But boring is underrated when the stakes are physical. The thing people call prudence often just sounds unglamorous, so they dismiss it before they have a reason to.
What would make that concern legitimate instead of just judgmental? Because there is a difference between saying you're overdoing the mystique and acting like every person who feels wonder is secretly a menace.
That's the useful distinction. It's legitimate when you're pointing at a real mismatch between feeling and risk. It's judgmental when you're just sneering at someone for being interested. You can say, "Your emotion is not a safety plan," without insulting the emotion itself.
Joe, am I overstating it if I say familiarity is the trap here? People see something expressive or humanish and start importing human rules onto it, like it looks like us means it should be handled like us.
No, that's the useful suspicion. Familiarity can make people softer, and softness can turn into denial. But the mistake isn't caring too much. The mistake is letting caring rewrite the facts. The animal's body is still the body, and that doesn't become less true because you feel tender toward it.
So empathy gets to stay, but it doesn't get to edit reality. That's the rule. And the same thing cuts the other way too, because strong feelings can make people over-romanticize or over-fear the same animal.
Yeah, either one can make you less accurate. If you're romanticizing it, you start hunting for a soft story. If you're over-fearing it, you stop seeing anything except threat. The fair version sits in the middle of those two distortions, not because middle is magically correct, but because both extremes start inventing things.
That seems like the cleanest takeaway. Ask the uncomfortable question, but ask it for the right reason, not to make the animal sound cute, not to make yourself sound brave, just to get the danger right.
Exactly. The honest version is usually less cinematic than people want, but it's a lot more useful. You can respect the animal and still keep the boundary where reality says it belongs. And that boundary is what keeps curiosity from turning into nonsense.
So I think the honest landing here is pretty simple. People downplay chimpanzee risk because familiarity starts talking before judgment does. They see a face, hands, a body that reads as almost human, and some part of the brain goes, well, this can't be that different. That feeling is real. It is also a bad guide if you let it decide the conclusion for you.
That's the clean version. Familiarity doesn't cancel risk. It just changes the order of operations in your head. The emotional reaction comes first, then the facts have to fight their way in. And if the animal looks vaguely like us, people tend to overuse their own social instincts on it, which is useful for empathy and terrible for prediction.
And that's the part I think people resist saying out loud. We don't just assess danger, we negotiate with it. If something feels familiar, we start shaving off the sharp edges in our mind before we've earned that right. It's not that people are stupid. It's that resemblance is persuasive in a sneaky, annoying way.
Right, and the correction is not to swing all the way into coldness. Nobody needs to turn chimpanzees into cartoon villains to take them seriously. The better move is to say, the resemblance matters emotionally, but it does not make the danger go away. If anything, it makes the danger easier to underestimate, which is exactly why you have to be careful with the story you tell yourself.
Joe, am I overstating it if I say familiarity starts acting like fake evidence? Because that feels like the trap. We see something that looks close enough to human, and we begin filling in the blanks with our own assumptions, almost like the face itself is handing us a waiver. That seems wrong in a very human, very predictable way.
No, that is a fair way to phrase it. Familiarity feels like a clue, but it can be more like a filter. It lets some information in and blocks some other information out. So the honest answer is not ignore the resemblance. The honest answer is notice the resemblance, then stop it from doing too much work. That's the discipline here. Respect is harder than sentiment because sentiment wants to make the object of attention less complicated than it is.
So the mistake isn't admiration, it's substitution. People don't just say, that looks like us. They quietly jump to, so it must be safe in the ways that matter to me. That's where the thinking slips. And honestly, that's useful to say out loud because it happens everywhere, not just with chimps.
Exactly. And if you want the sharper version of the rule, it is this. Resemblance should make you more careful about projection, not less careful about risk. You can feel the pull of the similarity without pretending it tells you the whole story. If anything, the pull is the reason to slow down.
Which is why the topic is weirdly useful, even after you take the dramatic stuff out of it. Chimpanzees are unsettling, partly because they sit right on that edge where empathy and caution have to coexist. People want a neat category. They want harmless like a pet or simple predator you never confuse with yourself. But the real answer is messier than either one.
That's the part worth keeping. The edge is the point, not a flaw in the conversation. The closer something feels to us, the more temptation there is to project meaning onto it, and the more careful we should be about not confusing projection with knowledge. That doesn't make the animal less interesting. It makes it more worth understanding on its own terms.
So the takeaway is not be scared of anything that looks like us, which would be silly. It's don't let resemblance do the thinking for you. If the thing is close enough to trigger your social instincts, that is exactly when you should slow down and ask what those instincts are hiding from you.
That's the useful version. Familiarity should raise the standard, not lower it. If something looks a bit like us, that is not a promise of safety, and it's not a reason to turn your brain off. It's a reason to be more precise about what it is, what it isn't, and what your gut is trying to hand-wave away.
Good. So we can stop pretending the resemblance makes chimpanzees less dangerous. It makes them more fascinating, and those are different jobs. One of them is for your feelings, the other one is for your judgment.
And that is probably the cleanest place to leave it. Sharper respect, less projection, and no fake comfort just because the face is familiar. So, that's the end of this one. Thanks for joining us on Say the Question. Subscribe or follow, and we'll be back tomorrow.